Funding for conversations with the candidates is provided by Iowa Corn, Iowa Corn Growers Association, bipartisan, farmer-driven policy.
Hello, I'm Dan Miller. Thank you for joining us. You are about to see something unusual, a conversation about issues and ideas, civil and substantive, between one of Iowa's top political journalists and the candidates whose quest for the presidency she covers. This series of conversations is defined as much by what it isn't as by what it is. And it most certainly is not today's typical television fare. It isn't a debate, a shout-fest, nor a game of gotcha. There are no audiences to play to, no pundits to persuade. It's a conversation, like the one you might have at the corner cafe, only longer and without incessant interruptions. It's a conversation where you meet the person behind the politician, the candidate behind the campaign. Hosting it is Des Moines Register political columnist Kathie Obradovich. She knows the candidates, she knows Iowa, and is the perfect person to find out on Iowans' behalf what we haven't heard before. We've invited candidates Bachmann, Gingrich, Paul, Perry, Romney, and Santorum. Speaker Gingrich joins Kathie now.
Thank you for being here, Mr. Speaker. Now, today, as you're sitting here, you are the front runner in Iowa and in a lot of the national polls. But let's talk about last summer. You've said you were left for dead. Your staff had quit. You were out of money. How close were you to throwing in the towel at that point?
Oh, Calista and I discussed it 2 or 3 times over the course of, I think, June and July. And it was very hard. I've been studying and doing political things for 53 years, since I was 15. And I would say that June and July were the 2 hardest months of those 53 years in terms of what was happening politically.
What made you decide to stay in?
Well, Calista kept saying, get to the debates. She said, look, we've already had all these attacks. We've already had all this battering. Michael Kroll, who's from Iowa, took over the campaign and is very frugal. He's a good Midwesterner in that sense. And we made a commitment that we would spend less than we took in every month, which in July was really hard because we didn't raise much money. And we just gradually began. It was like watching a ship that almost capsized and very slowly began to right itself. And then the debates were an enormous help. I mean, people saw a positive message. They saw somebody who actually had the experience at the national level. And every single debate, we got a little stronger, and it was very encouraging. You mentioned Calista, and I've heard that she was very instrumental in getting your campaign back on track. Tell me just a little bit about what her role was there. Well, at one level, it was very important because she went to Luther College, and a year ahead of her was Michael Kroll. And so that relationship goes all the way back to the college days.
So they knew each other?
They've known each other a long time, which was important because when you had this disorienting moment and all of the professional consultants left. I mean, everybody who'd been with me over the years stayed except for one person. And so our core team was fine. But to have somebody you trusted totally take over, that you could go campaign, do interviews, try to raise money, and you had total faith that they had integrity, that they understood you, that they were going to do things right. That was a big part of it. And she and Michael did a lot of things in that sense. And then second, she's much more artistic than I am. She is was a piano major at Luther. She plays the French horn. She's in a professional choir at the Basilica. And she has an eye for things. She just has a New York Times best-selling children's book that's a picture book that she was really deeply involved in called Sweet Land of Liberty. And so she would help Michael with a lot of the artistic parts of this. I mean, looking at the campaign logo, looking at the first brochures, looking at the first advertising. And the other piece is just good, sound common sense. Going into the debates, it was really important just to be balanced. I mean, because people...
Balanced what do you mean by balanced?
I think people are really worried about the country, and I think they want somebody who's a mature adult. I think they have a sense that we've tried an amateur for the last 3 years. He doesn't know what he's doing. It's obvious he doesn't know what he's doing. And having somebody who was stable, knowledgeable, who had actually done it before. And I'll give you an example. Some of my closest supporters said before the first debate, you got to go in and hit a home run. The campaign's almost dead. And I said, you can't do that. Because if you go into a debate trying to hit a home run, you look like somebody who's trying to hit a home run. What you have to do is go in, be very patient, be very steady. When a moment occurs, which will be spontaneous, then you take the moment, but you can't force the moment. And she was very supportive of that kind of calm, deliberate. She's a performer, and my granddaughter Maggie, who's 12 and is a ballerina and plays the violin as a performer. So I had these two performance coaches. And then my one son-in-law used to be the head of coach education at the U.S. Tennis Association. So I'm getting coaching. I mean, we have a lot of family coaching going on.
Okay. I'm going to ask you about that later, but some of the people that you have served with in the past, I mean, you said you need an adult, you need somebody who's stable and mature, and that's not always how they've described you in the past. They've said that you're volatile, that you were full of ideas but short on follow-through. Has that changed, or are they just wrong?
Well, you know, it's funny. I spent 5 years winning a congressional seat. I lost twice. So from 1974 to 1978, I was trying to become a congressman. When I became a congressman, I became the head. Before I was sworn in, I was asked to chair a planning committee to create a majority because we've been the minority for 24 years. I spent 16 years helping us get to a majority. We then spent 3 years creating the framework for 4 consecutive balanced budgets, the only 4 in your lifetime. Now, you would think that those are signs of persistence. I'm the longest serving teacher in the senior military. I've taught 1- and 2-star generals and admirals for 23 years. But I think what happens is, you know, I'm a genuine change agent. I mean, I think the reason you see people in both establishments, both the Republican and the Democratic establishment, genuinely horrified at the idea of Gingrich as president, is that I will really break up their system. I mean, I'm an outsider, even though I've served in Washington. I don't particularly care about their conventions and the way they get along, and I'm prepared to represent a very profound change. And I think there are a number of people for whom that is disruptive, and so what they describe is the disruption. You know, here's somebody who comes in and says, no, we're actually going to pass a welfare reform bill, and by the way, we're going to get a liberal Democrat named Bill Clinton to sign it. Well, if you're a purist, you're going, but I'd rather have a bill that doesn't get signed because then it's pure. You know, and you just have to look at the balancing act of trying to govern under our Constitution.
I mean, there's a lot of concern right now in Congress that people are not interested in that balancing act, that there's a lot of, in your party, folks who really do want that pure legislation or that pure principle. They don't want to give in. How do you move them off the diamond?
You know, it's interesting. We had today a very important breakthrough, in that there's a Wyden-Ryan Medicare reform bill that represents Senator Wyden, a Democrat from Oregon, Congressman Paul Ryan from Wisconsin. It's a bipartisan effort to really come to grips with one of the major entitlement challenges we face. And to have that bill introduced and have them publicly together talking about this is really a healthy, maybe it's the beginning of breaking up the logjam and starting to get Democrats and Republicans to talk with each other. And I think that Paul Ryan and Ron Wyden deserve some real credit for having had, I mean, this is a very courageous thing for each of them to do, to reach out, come together, and offer a genuinely bipartisan bill, given the atmosphere you have in Washington.
Now, you're facing at least a couple of opponents who are capable financially of dragging out the nomination potentially for a long time. You've said that you've recovered from having a campaign that was in debt at one point. Are you going to be able to compete financially to get to the end point, however long it lasts?
Well, I mean, I'll never have as much money as Mitt Romney can raise. I mean, that's a fact. You have to start this race understanding that. Well, on the other hand, we run a campaign that's a lot less expensive than his, so there's a certain balancing act. I always thought that, and we have hundreds of people a day coming to newt.org and giving money who just randomly show up. I mean, and so we've begun to build a real base of donors. Somebody pointed out that I probably have the highest percent of my money from small donors of any candidate in the race this year. And so that gives you a real opportunity. And we always thought that we had to come in the top 3 in Iowa, do reasonably well in New Hampshire, recognizing that is Mitt's last big fortress. I mean, if he can't carry New Hampshire, the race is over in terms of his candidacy. So I've always assumed that I had to do well enough here to be seen as a national candidate. Remember, a month ago, if we were doing this interview, nobody would have thought of me as the front runner. So I always had to have a strategy with very limited resources of using good ideas, giving speeches, doing talk radio, doing television and newspaper to gradually build a momentum. And the goal was, frankly, to get to South Carolina, where we have a very big base. We just had 2 Tea Party votes in South Carolina. One was 75% to endorse me, and the other was 80% to endorse me. And so I've always thought that once we got to South Carolina and then Florida, I could begin to win the race decisively. What changed was, in a manner you'll have to describe as a reporter, because I can't explain it. For some reason, the country seemed to talk to itself over the last 6 weeks. And all of a sudden, we began to get supporters. I mean, and we've seen it happen here, but people are coming out of the woodwork, and I think we're releasing some 40 or 50 endorsements today, and it's happening in Florida right now. I just had a call yesterday from somebody in Minnesota. I mean, there's just random people saying, I've been thinking about it, and yeah, you should be the president.
Well, you've said yourself, and I think you've run a pretty unconventional campaign to this point. And in addition to being a candidate for president, the front-running candidate for president, you've been kind of doing book signings and movie premieres, et cetera, as you've been going along. Why didn't you decide to make running for president a full-time enterprise?
It is. It's just that I see all those things fitting the same package. I mean, I think my books are integral to my presidency. If you want to know what I believe about American exceptionalism, you'll see it in a book called A Nation Like No Other, or you'll see it in Callista's children's book, Sweet Land of Liberty, where Ellis the elephant introduces 4 to 8-year-olds. If you want to, and again, I'm wearing Washington's command flag. I've written 3 novels. 2 have been published, 1 will come out next year, on Washington and the Revolutionary War. These things are all part of this.
But the books you're promoting don't benefit the campaign, right? They're a personal enterprise, right?
But they benefit the idea base. I mean, and I know this is sort of unusual, but if you really think of yourself as a candidate of ideas, not slogans, not talking points from your consultants, but somebody who really wants the country to have a new conversation, and who wants the country to be, to think about what does American exceptionalism mean? Why does the Declaration of Independence matter? Then all these different pieces actually come together.
Would you see yourself as still writing books as president? Would you have time for that?
Well, you'd certainly write things. I've talked about teaching a course from the White House, and by which and this is something I actually recommended to Governor Schwarzenegger when he was in his budget crisis. And I said, what you ought to do is on Saturday mornings, you ought to teach online an introduction to the California budget. Because the people of California don't understand why Sacramento is such a mess. They don't understand what the real choices are. And you can't carry it in a 20-minute speech.
So you'll be the professor in chief?
Well, or just the leading educator. I mean, and it's a two-way street. The most complicated thing we're trying to do right now, and it's the 4th item at newt.org in our proposed 21st century contract with America, is we're trying to figure out how do we build a social medium where you come back to talk to us. I mean, I know how to send out a tweet to 1,300,000 people. What if all 1,300,000 decide to respond? And so we're really trying to figure out, can you really lead, can you have the American people come together to govern themselves rather than just have them pick the 537 elected officials? And I think the new social media gives you a chance to have much more participation than we've ever had before.
Back in May, just as you were getting started with your campaign, you were asked what you were worried about as you were getting started. And you said you were worried about your health because running for president was what you compared it to a marathon. Mm-hmm. How are you feeling today? Are you keeping up with the pace?
Yeah, what I discovered was that it's a marathon that turns out to be, 262 dashes. I mean, it's not that you are running at a set pace, but you get up in the morning and you try to get as much done, and then you stop. And we've done a lot, and Callista's helped a lot, and my daughters have helped a lot at just pacing. Taking a Sunday off, or slowing down, or having some sense of rhythm, because otherwise you would burn out and you would get brittle.
You speak often of the ethic of service to country and how you formed that as you were following around your stepfather to military bases around the world. Why did you decide not to choose a military career to serve your country?
I think that when I was very young, it struck me, particularly watching the French Fourth Republic destroyed by the paratroopers and General de Gaulle brought back to create the Fifth Republic. And listening to my father's friends, they'd come over on a Sunday afternoon and they would talk. And everything about their life in the Army was bounded by politics. You know, we lived in Capehart housing, which was named for an Indiana senator who had passed a bill to put public housing. This is at Fort Riley, Kansas. Or they would talk about reductions in forces and guys who used to be a major who are now a sergeant because they wanted to stay in and finish out their career. And every time I turned around, it was the rules of engagement politicians set. And it struck me that to really be effective, you had to be involved in this larger life. And then I read, when I was a senior in high school, I read Theodore White's Making the President in 1960. And he has this remarkable page where he's describing Nelson Rockefeller's career. And Rockefeller had been the Assistant Secretary for Latin American Affairs under Franklin Roosevelt. And he said, Rockefeller suddenly realized that real power in America came from winning elections. And that he could take every appointed job he wanted. But if he wanted to understand how to actually get something done, it required winning elections. And so he runs for...
So you knew at the time, from the time you were a teenager to going to college, that politics was what you were going to do?
Well, that citizenship was what I wanted to do, and it turned out the way you do citizenship, in my judgment, is politics. But it's a little bit, again, my dad served 27 years in the infantry, and I think there's a sense of honor, duty, country. He was not a West Point graduate. He was Gettysburg College. But he was ROTC. But this sense of that service to your country is probably the highest value other than a religious vocation.
Since you've been leading in the polls, your opponents and in both parties, frankly, are doing their best to dig up as much dirt on you as possible. And of course, you know, you've seen that in the debates. Are you regretting your commitment to not attack fellow Republicans in kind at this point?
No, I don't regret it, but there are moments when I chafe under it. I mean, I've made one or two mistakes and sort of shot back when I shouldn't have. I think
in the last debate, when you told Mitt Romney that he would have been a career politician, but for Teddy Kennedy, was that an example?
I couldn't help myself. It was too good a line, and he had set up too good an opportunity, but I shouldn't have done it. Look, this is. I mean, first of all, the American people don't have to elect me. And I ran for office. I've lost before. And I ran for office knowing I don't have a right to be president, but I have a right to present ideas. The whole purpose of my candidacy, in addition to winning, is to create a new cycle of ideas in the American system. And the speech I gave at the University of Iowa in brain science, for example, I think is a really important speech. I want to come back and try to give a speech at Iowa State on space and science and technology as a positive answer to Governor Romney's taking on my ideas about lunar colonies and all that. Yeah. Because, you know, one of the things you want to do in a society is create a sense of excitement about the future so that young people are engaged in learning things that are hard. I mean, the opportunities in brain science are revolutionary, and I'm hoping a whole new generation of doctors and biologists and people will get into that. The opportunities in space are revolutionary, and you'd love to have a new generation of Iowa State engineer graduates out there doing really interesting aerospace things. So if I can communicate a vision of a better future, that's part one of the campaign. Part two of the campaign, obviously, is to win and to try to convince people this is a vision worth being for. And in order to win, and this is a real experiment. I can't tell you today, given the millions of dollars being spent on advertising, telephone calls, direct mail, all of it negative. I don't know whether at the end of the day I will be the front runner in Iowa just because there's a certain weight of combined negativity that drags you down.
I'm sure you're getting advice from people saying you can't stick to this positive campaign.
Actually, I'm getting two kinds of advice. The traditional consultants are all going, you've got to hit back. Citizens walk up to me. I just got emails this morning saying, stay positive, have faith that the people of Iowa will see through this. And I think, and I'll tell you, everybody on the campaign feels, here in Iowa, feels very good about the fact that they can look people in the eye and say, we have a positive candidate and we have a positive campaign. And I think, a point you made in your column today, I think it's counterintuitive in the next week. I mean, we have an ad that'll come up next week where Calista and I are wishing people Merry Christmas. And we're talking in a totally positive way. And I just think if these guys keep this kind of negative junk, it is so discordant with the spirit of Christmas It's an interesting experiment in how people talk to each other and what people decide.
Yeah, they may have to take a break over the holidays. Well, Mitt Romney had a privileged upbringing, as the debate it came up in the debate. But he also has a reputation of being a very frugal man, very frugal in his habits. You grew up as a man with very modest means, but over time you've kind of gotten a reputation as a guy who likes a little luxury in his life on occasion. Why would voters believe that you're a better steward of the taxpayers' dollars?
It's easy. I balanced the federal budget for 4 consecutive years. We had this great call. Somebody who said, I'm going to be, this was to one of our volunteers. This got to me last night. I love this because I'm a big Green Bay Packer fan. I own a share of Green Bay stock. And somebody had called in and said, I'm for Newt because he has 4 Super Bowl rings. And then the person in the campaign said, what? They said, he balanced the budget 4 times. As far as I'm concerned, in government terms, that's 4 Super Bowls.
4 Super Bowls, okay.
And I just thought, so I would start, and I can look in the camera and say to people, the reason I know we can balance the budget is I'm the only person running who led the effort, and the only time in your lifetime that we've had 4 consecutive balanced budgets were because of my speakership. Now, I think people can look at that. When people learn that, it changes their mind, and they say, oh, okay.
Okay, well, you said that the negative stuff, though, starts to penetrate. and in the late November Iowa poll that the Des Moines Register ran, Iowa caucus goers rated you in 2nd place behind Herman Cain as the guy they thought was most likely to have a scandal in the White House. How do you get past that and get to the trust that's needed?
I think patience and time. People have to watch me. I think this is why the debates have helped so much, is that people got to see me directly. And they got to have a sense of, am I somebody they can trust? I think that's why the campaigning matters. We have a brand new campaign bus that arrives the day after Christmas, sort of a campaign gift, Christmas gift. Yeah. And I think as we crisscross the state and talk to people, they get to look me in the eye and they get to decide what they believe.
At the Family Leaders Thanksgiving Forum, you talked about receiving a copy from a friend of the 12-step program from Alcoholics Anonymous. And you said that even though you didn't have a drinking problem, you felt like you recognized some of the symptoms in yourself. Were you drunk on power, do you think?
No, I think I was exhausted. I think it was a sense of, it wasn't hubris, which is what drunken power would imply. It wasn't that I felt I was bigger. It was that I felt that I was so tired and I had tried to do so many things that I felt empty. It's a common challenge that nurses have because they spend all day taking care of other people, and at the end of the day, and I think I got to a point where I was overreaching and doing more than I could sustain. And I found that reading the big book and taking and getting a feel for the 12-step program was a very helpful part of beginning to unwind. And part of what I think the experience of Alcoholics Anonymous does for you is it teaches you that it's okay to be human. You just have to deal with it. You have to, it's not an excuse to do stupid things. It's a recognition that as a human being, you have limits and you have to somehow come to grips with who you are and how you're going to live out your life.
And is that a lesson that you think you'll be able to remember when you get into the White House, which is just, obviously, if you thought you were busy before.
No, actually, you're less busy because you're surrounded by this entire support mechanism. The speakership is an unusually demanding job. John Boehner's doing a very good job right now, and it's a very challenging job because you have fewer real resources. And yet you have all these members who have every right to come in and see you, and you're pulled in 100 different directions. But I would say that the other part of that is that becoming a grandfather was an enormous help. The depth of the marriage with Callista, and the way in which we relate to each other, the continuous interactions has been a great help.
What was the best advice that your grandchildren have given you about the campaign?
Keep smiling.
Keep smiling.
Yeah, one of the things that really worked at the last debate was Maggie and Robert were there along with Callista. Callista's mother came down, and Jackie, my younger daughter, and Jimmy were there. And every time that there was a break when other people were talking, I could look out and see them sitting there. And Maggie, who's 12, would create the largest possible smile. I mean, just to remind me to, you know. And I think part of it is because we're trying to draw a very clear contrast. I am a very happy advocate of a dramatically better future. I don't have any interest in getting in the mud throwing. I don't have any interest in getting down in the infighting. And yet everything about our normal natural, as you know, I mean, our normal natural political culture now has become amazingly destructive. And so you spend all day, every day, you know, R.C. Hammond, who, as you know, does press with me, I mean, one of R.C.'s major jobs is to somehow buffer and think through whatever the latest attack is, so that we can get all the we need to get all the normal human reactions out of the way before I meet with the press, and it's a challenge because being
what's wrong with
willful,
having normal human reactions?
Because your first reaction when somebody attacks you or somebody lies about you or somebody, you know, hits you in the kidneys politically, your first reaction is to hit back. Well, my campaign is entirely based on the idea that I'm not going to hit back. And so there's a certain point where you get tempted, and once or twice I've, as you pointed out, with the Teddy Kennedy line, once or twice I've just sort of, you know, hit back.
What was your experience been like campaigning in Iowa? You know, we often have to defend the caucuses as being a good place to start the presidential nomination process. You've obviously studied the history of this. What's been your experience?
I tell people that both Iowa and New Hampshire are really important, and that I would deeply oppose opening with a bigger state. You have, first of all, people here are now so used to this that when they meet you for the 8th or 9th time, they start to think you might be a serious candidate. Yeah. And so there's a depth of having seen it all before. There's a depth of conversation. I mean, one thing I know will happen is that over Christmas, people will be talking with each other. You know, as they slow down, take a few days off of work. You know, and I think part of what's going to, I'm hoping that part of what's going to happen is that they'll render judgment against negative ads. They'll say that that's not a good sign for the country. Yeah. I found that people are knowledgeable, that people, generally speaking, are very courteous, that they are willing to ask you very tough questions, that they are very diverse. I mean, people in the national media have this mistaken notion that you can categorize the Republican Party in Iowa. There are moderates, there are conservatives, there are people who are primarily economic, there are people who are primarily social, but it's really quite a group.
Yeah, and so it sounds to me like you would try to keep the Iowa caucuses first if you become the nominee.
I think the current system is really good. You start here, and it's very intimate, and it's a function of turnout because it's a caucus.
All right.
You then go to New Hampshire, where it's a primary, and you have a rhythm that's somewhat different, but they're equally sophisticated.
Okay.
So a candidate with almost no money. I mean, you know, somebody like Rick Santorum was a good friend of mine. If he had to start in California or Texas, I mean, it would be hopeless. But here, he can see people. He can go to 99 counties.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, for being here today. I appreciate it.
A reminder that you can see this conversation and all the others online at DesMoinesRegister.com and IPTV.org. And on the air, you can follow in-depth coverage of the caucus campaign and the politics of the day every day on the PBS NewsHour and every week on Iowa Press on Iowa Public Television. For Kathie Obradovich, I'm Dan Miller. Thank you for joining us.
Funding for Conversations with the Candidates is provided by Iowa Corn, Iowa Corn Growers Association, bipartisan, farmer-driven policy.